Hello, everyone. I think we're just waiting for a couple of more people, so maybe we'll wait a few minutes before we get started. Okay, so I think I'll kick it off now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Becoming a Bee Campus webinar. My name is Amanda Mosca. I'm an engagement coordinator with the Office of Sustainability at U Calgary, and I've been in this role for about 3 years now. I will be facilitating the webinar portion of this event, and at the end, we'll have a Q&A with our panel. So just to quickly introduce who's on our panel today, please help me welcome Rob Alexander, who's a digitization expert, Dr. Marianne Egermont, who is a bio-inspired design expert, Dr. Mindi Summers, an instructor with biological sciences, Dr. Jenna Vamosi, who is a plants and native planting expert, and Dr. Jessica Theodore with the Biological Sciences Collections. So there will be a Q&A portion at the end with our panel, and I'll ask that any questions be shared in the Q&A section rather than the chat. That will just be easier for us to facilitate towards the end. This webinar is also being recorded, so it will be shared with you after if you want to revisit the slides. And with that, I think we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so I'd first like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and the University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name for this place is Mohkinstsis. So the topics I will cover today are bee campus designation, native pollinators and threats that they are currently facing, actions that we can all take to better support native pollinators, resources in case anyone wants to get further involved, and then our panel Q&A at the end. So earlier this year, U Calgary received our Bee Campus designation from a nonprofit organization called Bee City Canada. Bee City Canada was founded in 2015 and following in the footsteps of Bee City USA. So they offer programs and certifications to recognize cities, schools, organizations, and businesses, and post-secondary campuses who are committing to helping pollinators. So Toronto was the first bee city designated in 2016, and the first bee campus was Canadore College in Parry Sound in Ontario that same year. Something that's interesting is the City of Calgary also received their Bee City designation earlier this year as well, And this was strictly coincidental. We didn't collaborate with them, but all of the applications for Bee City designations are available on the Bee City Canada website. So you can see what our city has committed to through reading their application. Something that I found very interesting from their application is their Bee Boulevard initiative, where medians are seeded with native wildflowers in some neighborhoods, and interpretive signage has been installed along pathways. So I want to introduce you to our campus community garden because this was a focal point in our application, and it's where a lot of our pollinator-friendly practices takes place. So the campus community garden was created in 2001, and it's currently on the west side of campus behind the heating plant near the sport fields. This is its third location, so it had been in 2 other spots on campus prior to 2015 when it was moved to its current spot. And it's run in partnership with the Office of Sustainability and the SU Student Garden Club. There are about 62 plot rentals that are available for individual or team use, as well as large communal spaces for the Student Garden Club to manage. So the Garden Club, they plant, maintain, and harvest these communal areas. Some of it's allocated towards the SU Food Bank. They also host weekly get-togethers where they work in the garden, they offer support to anyone who's around, and depending on time of year, they might harvest and prepare some food. They also host events and tours for other groups on campus, like other student groups or classes. And unfortunately, the garden is not operating this year, but the Garden Club is still active. It's closed due to the campus closure with COVID-19. But it is an organic garden, so there are no synthetic fertilizers or pesticide use, and it's a closed loop composting system. So any organic waste produced on site is composted on site and then returned to the soil. An interesting recent upgrade within the last couple of years was the creation or the build of our garden shed that houses communal tools and other shared items. And the Garden Club partnered with another student club called Emerging Leaders in Solar Energy. And these students actually installed a photovoltaic solar array on the garden shed, which powers lights inside of the shed, and also a little power bar where we've plugged speakers in for events and things like that. So UCalgary is the 10th Bee City campus in Canada, and currently there are 11. In order to receive this designation, we have committed to creating and improving pollinator habitat, raising awareness and educating our community about the importance of pollinators, and celebrating pollinators throughout the year or during National Pollinator Week in June. Our application highlighted, as I mentioned, lots to do with the garden. So pollinator habitat and education at the garden. We have communal areas that have been specifically designated for native wildflowers. We have 2 large raised beds that are fully planted with wildflowers, as well as some other communal areas that have berry bushes and some things like that. Additionally, anyone who participates in gardening, so if you've rented a plot, if you're a member of the garden club, or if you come for a tour or workshop, there is an educational piece about native pollinators and why they're important and what we're doing in the garden. I mentioned that it's also an organic garden, so the lack of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and chemicals definitely helps support pollinators and their habitat. And we have some installations that were designed by an artist and former student, Dylan McLernan. So he donated his sculpture Bank for Bees to the campus community garden, and it actually doubles as solitary bee habitat. So the sculpture is situated in a small wildflower garden, and he checks it regularly to see what species of bees are using it and how many bees are using it. He also designed and created these bee domiciles, which are small clay hanging ornaments, but again, they double as habitat for native bees. The City of Calgary is also committed to maintaining and enhancing pollinator habitat on campus with the renewal of our campus landscape plan. So this is in the process of being renewed, and preserving natural landscapes and biodiversity is a priority in the new plan. You can already see some of these design features in the McKimmie redevelopment plan for the Swan Mall. So they've adopted some planting practices there to enhance biodiversity. And our annual pollinator celebration event. So we had our first pollinator celebration last June during Pollinator Week. It was held at the garden, and activities included wildflower planting, a BioBlitz, which is a citizen science activity where participants, they go out with some guidebooks and their phones or cameras, and they look at different plants and animals they can find in the surrounding area. They can take pictures of these and upload them to an app called iNaturalist, and they can use their guide to identify the different species of plants and animals that they're seeing. We also had a bee box building workshop facilitated by the Alberta Native Bee Council, and there were talks by researchers at the event. So it was a big success. The event also celebrated the launch of our digital collection of native Alberta bee species, which I will talk about on the next slide. So the digital collection is available to anyone at biodiversity.ucalgary.ca, and it's a collaborative project between the Faculty of Science, Libraries and Cultural Resources, and the Department of Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering. It features these high-resolution photos of different native bee species. And since 2015, over 100,000 specimens have been collected by researchers in the Department of Biological Sciences. The purpose of this research is to better understand bees and other beneficial insects, to promote conservation, and to help identify and protect endangered bee species. And luckily, we have some of our researchers joining us today on our panel if you have further questions about research or the digital collection. So bees that are native to Canada, we have about 800 species, none of which produce honey. So honeybees are not native to North America, but they were brought over with settlers from Europe. Native bee species don't produce honey, but they provide something else that's really valuable, which is the service of pollination. They're also mostly solitary, so they nest in the ground rather than in a hive, and many of them don't sting. Tunneling in the soil improves soil quality and helps increase water movement and mixes nutrients into the soil. So they provide benefits to the soil as well as pollinating plants. So food security, this is the measure of availability of food and access to it, specifically availability and access to safe and nutritious food for everyone. And native pollinators are essential to wild plants as they are to cultivated crops that we eat. So 1/3 of what we eat actually depends upon pollinators, including some of our favorites like strawberries and carrots. And research has actually shown that in areas where pollinator diversity is declining, we actually see crop yield declining as well because the plants aren't being pollinated and fertilized. So this goes to show that we need a robust community of different bee species and other pollinators if we want to sustain food production and ensure local food security, as well as economic security, because we can see that the agricultural industry contributes drastically to the Canadian economy. So I want to provide 2 examples here in Canada that demonstrate the importance of pollinators to our food system. Bees require 2 key resources, which is food and nesting sites. And in highly managed areas like a crop field, one or both of these may be limited or missing. So the first example is canola fields. Now, when they are flowering, they do provide large availability of pollen and nectar, but it's short term because all of the plants bloom at once and then they're gone. So bees may struggle to find native flowers during the rest of the season. Natural habitat around canola fields is vital for bees, but it's also good for farmers and for crop production. There's evidence that canola yield is higher in areas where there are natural landscapes surrounding the crop fields. This could include wetlands, grasslands, forested areas. And when we have these natural landscapes bordering the crops, they provide habitat for native pollinators, which would increase crop pollination. They also provide habitat for things like spiders and beetles, which could prey on canola pests. So we have like a natural pesticide there as well. And one of our very own U Calgary researchers, Dr. Paul Galpern, worked on this study. Another example takes place on the east coast of Canada, looking at blueberry fields. So native bees do the majority of pollinating blueberry fields in PEI, although some farmers do bring in non-native honeybees for pollination services. Since the native bees have co-evolved with the plants in that area, they're also accustomed to maritime climate. They're better at pollinating. So for instance, honeybees that have evolved in Europe and maybe in a Mediterranean climate are less likely to be active in the cool, damp maritime weather. Native pollinators can also buzz pollinate, which is when they vibrate the blueberry flower to allow pollen to be released. And this is something non-native bees can't do. So native bees are more effective at pollinating blueberry crops. So ecosystem services, these are benefits provided by nature, things like food, water purification by plants, nutrient cycling in the soil, and carbon storage. And since most of the plants depend on pollinators for fertilization, and plants form the base of the food chain, I think it's safe to say that we wouldn't have healthy, thriving ecosystems without bees and pollinators. Plants anchor the soil to prevent erosion. They act as carbon stores and fuel the nutrient cycle. So we couldn't survive without plants and without bees. Some species of plants and bees have also developed a close interdependence. And the example I'll give is Brazil nuts and the euglossa bee. So the Brazil nut tree grows wild in the Amazon forest, and they can't actually be grown in plantations because they need to be pollinated by one specific species of bee, which is the euglossa bee. But this bee is dependent on one orchid species that is found only in the rainforest, and they're actually the only pollinators for a number of orchids in the forest. They're often referred to as orchid bees. So this means that without the orchids, there would be no euglossa bees, and without no euglossa bees, there would be no orchids. And without either of these, there wouldn't be Brazil nut trees and many of the other insects and animals that rely on these plants and trees. This includes the people whose livelihoods include collection and sale of Brazil nuts. So you can see how closely everything is interconnected. So the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, these were adopted by all UN member states in 2015. And the Agenda for Sustainable Development, the deadline to achieve these is 2030, so in 10 years. And these goals provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people on the planet now and into the future. Looking at many of these goals, you can see that they are all connected. And I want to touch on how pollinators and bees contribute to many of these goals. So since we know that the diversity of wild pollinators has a direct and positive impact on crop yields, they help to ensure food and economic security for the world's population. So with the decline of these species, we would see negative consequences on our ecosystems, our natural resources, and the quality and quantity of food. When we look at goals like number 1, 2, and 3, ending poverty, ending hunger, and improving health and well-being, we know that without food security, these are unlikely to be achieved. Also, goals like number 8, decent work and economic growth. This would be negatively affected looking at our food industry. And also goals related to environmental sustainability, like climate action and life on land. So if the ecosystem services on which humanity relies continues to be degraded, we would see these ambitious goals collapse. So native pollinators are declining worldwide, and a few of the major culprits that I'll talk about are pesticides, habitat loss, and disease. There are new theories, though, that suggest that climate change could throw off pollination schedules because with the warmer weather, it's affecting where plants grow and when they bloom, and bees may not be primed to meet the needs of the new schedules. So pesticides, these are chemicals that are used widely on crops and even just garden plants to kill fungus and insects and other plant diseases. A common one found in Canada are neonicotinoids, and virtually all corn grown in Canada and 2/3 of our soybean crops are treated with neonicotinoids. The chemical is commonly used as like a grain or as a seed coating or soil drench. So the chemical is taken up in the plant as it grows, and you find it in all of the plant tissues. So this means that every time an insect or a pollinator visits the plant and collects pollen and nectar, it's getting some of that chemical in the pollen and nectar. And exposure to the chemical can affect navigation, learning, food collection, disease resistance, and reproduction. But not only would it harm foraging bees, since it's in the pollen and nectar that goes into larval food or for baby bees, it's destroying the next generation as well. An example of pesticide use negatively affecting native pollinators and crops is the control of spruce budworm in Atlantic Canada. So in New Brunswick, the chemical phenotrophion was used to treat spruce budworm, which is a pest. And spraying was done near commercial blueberry fields. And in the county where that happened, blueberry crop value dropped about 70% as a result of spraying. So habitat destruction includes the loss of nesting sites, food sources, and mating sites. And it's a huge issue in the decline of wild pollinators. Since we know here in Canada, many pollinators nest in the ground, any plowing, digging, cutting, paving, any disturbance will affect where wild bees make their home. So a couple of examples: fragmentation. This is where the habitat is broken up into smaller divided parts, like little isolated islands. And individuals may struggle to meet their needs in that small island of habitat. They may need more connected, undisturbed land to survive, to find those food sources, nesting sites, and mating sites. And urbanization is the loss of natural habitat for built environment, so for development. Monoculture is another cause of habitat loss. So this is cultivation of one single crop in an area, like that vast, expansive canola field. So as we learned in a previous slide, wild pollinators have trouble establishing in these areas because there's one kind of flower that blooms in one narrow window of time. So they might struggle to find food throughout the rest of the season. Agricultural producers also use all of the soil available for growing crops. So in the process, they're removing acres of land that may once have been filled with wildflowers and other sources of nutrition for the bees. And invasive species. These are organisms that are not native to a specific area. They could be plants or animals, and they can cause ecological harm to the new environment they've been brought to. So often they bring with them competition with native pollinators for resources and nest sites. They could introduce pathogens that the native species are not immune to, and they can pollinate invasive plants. So native pollinators have co-evolved with native plants, and with the introduction of invasive plants, they might not be able to utilize those as a resource. So they're losing their food and shelter resources. So bees are susceptible to attacks from parasites and pathogens, and this tends to be more prevalent in areas where they are living in close proximity to one another, or living in dense areas. And bee hotels, such as the picture shown here, are an example of that. Now, bee hotels and bee boxes are actually really great because they offer a sanctuary to pollinators, especially in areas where habitat has been lost, like urban areas. But because they host bees at a higher density than in a natural nesting site, disease and pathogens can spread quickly among them. So it's important to thoroughly clean these each season and disinfect all of the different tubes and boxes and areas. And it could also be beneficial to spread out the different habitat areas so they're not all living so closely in that one box. it's kind of like giving them an opportunity to practice social distancing. So some of the things that we can all do to support pollinators where we live, eliminating pesticide use is a big one. So anything that's a synthetic or chemical fertilizer or pesticide. Encouraging local council to implement pollinator-friendly policies and practices. As I mentioned, the city of Calgary is now a designated bee city. So that's really reassuring to see that they are prioritizing this and making those changes. And so I really would encourage everyone to read their application. Buying products from sustainable agricultural practices. So, you know, ideally like smaller scale, local, organic farms when you can. Building and monitoring a bee box on your property, just remembering to clean it thoroughly. Participating in citizen science activities. So we're still learning a lot about native pollinators and what's going on. So the more information we have, if you take some time to go outside and upload information to the iNaturalist app or Bumblebee Watch, you really are contributing to science and helping us figure out what's living in our area and what biodiversity is looking like. Taking the pollinator pledge through Bee City Canada, and mowing your lawn less and not raking all of your leaves in the fall. So since native bees nest in the soil disturbance will disturb them. So leaving your yard a little bit messy is okay. And lastly, creating your own pollinator-friendly garden. So anyone with a little bit of space can grow a pollinator-friendly garden, and here are just a few tips. So planting colorful flowers that provide blooms all year long. This is something that we took into consideration with our wildflower garden or wildflower beds at the community garden. Considering plants that bloom early in the spring, midsummer, and late summer, so there's blooms all year long, and planting a variety of different flower types. Selecting native or heirloom varieties of plants. This is not only important for bees because we know they've co-evolved with these plants and that they use them as resources, but it's great for us or for gardeners because native plants are better adapted to our climate, so they're a lot more low maintenance. They require less watering and fertilizing and fussing over. Consider an organic garden, again, so not using pesticides. And enhancing habitat and nesting ground by leaving some brambles and twigs and leaves over winter. It's also important to try not to disturb your garden until you've seen bees emerging in the spring. It can be tempting when we have that first warm weekend of the year to get in there and clean everything up. But if you haven't seen bees yet, it's likely that they're still nesting underground and disturbance can be harmful to them. So this is just an image that I pulled from the Bee City Canada website that depicts an example of a pollinator-friendly garden. Looking at it, you could see diversity is key, so lots of different types of plants. Some are low to the ground, some are taller, some are shrubs. So this is important, and it's also a little messy, which is okay. There's some downed twigs and branches and leaves that are left there, but it still looks beautiful. So to kind of summarize the slides, we all depend on the survival of bees, everyone in the world. And bees are declining as a result of human activities. But this means that we all have the power to make a positive impact through choices and changes that we can make, large or small. It all matters. And if you do want to get more involved and learn more, I mentioned this slide deck will be available after, so I'd encourage you to explore some of these links. Check out our digital collection. I've also included some planting guides, and there are some really great resources through the digital collection as well. The Alberta Native Bee Council is a great resource, and they offer bee box building kits. So this box depicted here is one that we built with the Alberta Native Bee Council. And they also have form and instructions on how to monitor it. So you can also kind of contribute to citizen science with your bee box. The iNaturalist app and Bumblebee Watch are other resources for citizen science where you can upload things that you're seeing in your area and explore what's happening around the city. And lastly, Bee City Canada. This is where you can read any application for any of the Bee City Canada designations. And they also have a fantastic resource page. They have planting guides for all different regions across Canada, including ours. And they even have a list of where you can buy these plants. So if you want to create a pollinator-friendly garden, they'll tell you what types of plants to buy and even where you can get them. It's fantastic. So that's it for the formal part of this webinar. We're going to move into our panel discussion, but I first want to shout out to Friends of the Environment Foundation. We received a grant from them to support our Bee Campus initiatives. And I also want to let everyone know Pollinator Week is coming up in June. And although we can't do an in-person pollinator celebration this year like we did last year, we will be posting a lot on social media. So if you give us a follow, we'll be posting lots throughout Pollinator Week and in general. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I would invite our panelists to come back on. And my colleague, Alex Howard, will facilitate the question session.
Okay, everyone, hi. Can everyone hear me okay? Maybe just a nod. Yes, I'm seeing some nods, excellent. Hi, so as Amanda mentioned, I'm Alex, and I'll be facilitating the Q&A that follows up our presentation today. And I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much to Amanda for that enlightening presentation and for sharing all of your wealth of knowledge about pollinators with us. Everyone who might have a question for Amanda or any of our panelists, feel free to type that in the chat box or in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try our best to get through all of your questions. And I wanted to take a moment before we start posing questions to our panelists just to briefly give us introductions to all of our panelists that we have with us today, and just to mention you know, like the wealth of interdisciplinary knowledge that we have coming at the problem of how to support pollinators on the Calgary campus. So in here, it may or may not correspond to an order within the Zoom chat box, so let's give it a go. So we have Dr. Mindi Summers, who's an instructor in biosci and who works on ecology and evolutionary biology. We have Professor Marianne Egermont from the School of Engineering, and she's our expert in bio-inspired design, which I think could be a fascinating link to some of the conversations about our Bee campus. Professor Jana Vamosi, who is a professor in biosci, focusing again on ecology and evolutionary biology, specifically of plants, are experts in plants and native plants and pollinators and their relationships today. We have Professor Jessica Theodore, also a biosci professor in ecology and evolutionary biology, and I believe the director of the biosciences collections. So a fascinating perspective to bring to our digital collections of pollinators as well. We have Lincoln Best, who's an independent scientist and a bee expert who is cataloging, oh, we don't have Lincoln today? Okay, well, we could have had Lincoln, but we still have a wealth of knowledge, even though he's not able to join us today. And we have Rob Alexander, who's our digitization specialist with libraries and cultural resources. So again, some really rich interdisciplinary knowledge joining us today on the webinar. So I'm going to start off with a few of the questions that have come in through the Q&A, and I'm going to flip them out to whoever feels perhaps most qualified to answer them. And we'll see how that goes. Maybe raise a hand or just dive in if you feel comfortable. But one of the first questions came in from an attendee about bee boxes and just looking for some practical tips about where the best place to set them up is to promote sort of, safety and health for pollinators. For example, would it be best to have them in a shady or a sunny location, close to vegetation, far from vegetation? Is there anything to consider around wind or other sort of interactions with the environment? So where would you recommend?
I'm happy to answer that question. In terms of kind of bee hotels, which are the ones that you'll commonly see kind of at the grocery store or other areas, those are for solitary nesting bees. And so when you're thinking about where to place those kind of hotels, you need to be able to think about the bees are going to be overwintering in that box. So you do want to have it in a place that's protected from the wind, and ideally in an area that's going to get as much sun as possible over the winter to keep the hotel as warm as possible. In terms of kind of vegetation, I would say probably placement more in terms of light is more important, and placing it about a meter or so off the ground would be good placement. For bumblebee boxes, so those are different. So bumblebees are going to be using that over the summer to kind of build their colony. And so the bee itself is not going to be overwintering in that box. And so bumblebee boxes, kind of placing those, burying them in the ground is an option, or placing them kind of closer to the ground is a better placement for those boxes.
Great. And maybe just a bit of a follow-up question when we're talking about bee boxes and the logistics of them. Is there a time of year that's best to clean out your bee box if now you're very concerned that you're not giving bees sufficient opportunities for social distancing? When's the best time to do that when you know the bees won't be disturbed?
Yeah, so you can clean out both your bee hotels and your bee boxes about once a year. The timing is going to be different though. So for your bee hotel, you'd want to be cleaning it out in spring after your new bees have emerged. So it might be closer to early summer in Calgary, depending on our weather. But you want to kind of wait for those new bees to have all emerged from your bee hotel, and then you'll clean it out. And for your bee boxes, instead, you're going to be you can bring those inside or clean them out after the summer season, once all of the new bees have emerged from that one.
Awesome. Bit of a different question that's a little bit more about bee and other insect behavior. Do bees and wasps compete for resources, in sporting events? What's the relationship between bees and wasps?
I can answer this question a bit. Jana might have some other ideas in terms of the plant angle on it. So many bees and wasps both act as pollinators, so they'll be using a lot of the same floral resources through the summer. Typically though, there's high enough floral resources that there's not necessarily direct competition. Sometimes you may see kind of aggressive interactions between bees and wasps at different times, and that's more of a defensive mechanism that you might see. So if you're seeing something like that out in your garden, it may be that they're getting too close to one another's colony or area where they're living.
Awesome. So for our next question, I'd like to maybe just open it up a little bit to all of our panelists and to get into some of that interdisciplinary perspective I mentioned earlier. But thinking back to the creation of the digital collection of our pollinators that we have at U Calgary, it's a partnership between, as I understand, between biosci, between engineering, between library and cultural resources. And I'm wondering if our different panelists, if you could weigh in on sort of how did that project come to be? Like what catalyzed that project? How did you find their process of drawing on one another's skills? What would you say about that project as a collaboration so far?
I might be able to start, but I'll hand it over to you, Rob, pretty quick. We started actually with the plants, and Rob, maybe you can help me with exactly how you came about hiring a student to do our reference collection. But we have a reference collection of sort of one pretty specimen of every species that lives in Alberta for the plants. And so we chose that as the starting point. And our digital library crew was fantastic at getting all the pieces of equipment that were necessary to be able to take the images and make a suitable database. And they were so fantastic that I was like, wow, there's so many things you could do with this, like bees. And then I think Mindi took it from there. Is that about, have I missed anything?
I think that's a great example of just that interdisciplinary. We hired a student who did the work, so we set up the project itself once Jana approached us about it, and then the student worked on it throughout the summer. And she was in studying ecology, actually, so it was a very pertinent project for her. And using that as our model, we did the same thing with the bees in a couple of phases, using students to really do the work, where we get things going and operating and just act as advisors in the library. It's the students that do the bulk of the work, and they can walk out of it, hopefully with some really practical skills at the end of these projects. And they do fantastic work, and they come into it with great ideas and lots of enthusiasm for it as well. So we learn how to improve our projects through working with them. And we've done 2 phases of the bees, and we're now working with Mindi on zoology specimens that students gather, and they do the work as well. And so we're growing this collection through the students. And I have to do very little to oversee it. It's really fantastic.
Awesome. I wonder, maybe you could say a little bit more about how do you see people interacting with the collection for the most part so far?
A lot of, so the digital images are available, and same with the herbarium. It provides access to anyone. So students can use it as they're doing their research. Instructors can download the images or point the students towards images. The public can use them, and we've had some requests for like small scale publications or use on websites or with news stories, that kind of thing. So it's slowly getting a bigger profile, and they're all available to be downloaded in high resolution as well. So if you can't make it into the herbarium or biosciences, you can go online and use these images. It's not quite the same thing, but it does provide advantages in terms of being able to zoom in and look at some of these details that are kind of hard to see otherwise, or can be. So there's some advantages to it as well.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you. We have a great question from Claire about bio-influenced design that I'm going to pull to the forefront. Maybe Marianne, you could take this one. How could we include more bio-influenced design in new Calgary buildings, either through new buildings that are forthcoming or through possible retrofits to older buildings, in order to support sustainability and native pollinators? So I guess that's the first part of the question. And then, are there things that we can do a little bit more DIY style at home if we wanted to incorporate some bio-influenced design into our homes for pollinator health?
Wow, okay, I'm being put on the spot here.
A big one, big 2 actually.
So I'll probably sort of take a step back and say, first of all, we can learn a lot from looking at our natural world. And the way I was involved with this project was I was interested to see what we could learn from local bee species. And Dr. Summers was able to find a fantastic student who I think is one of the attendees today, Holly Kirstens, who did most of the work on doing research on these native species. So, you know, what can we learn from the coloration in bees, right? That's a structural color, not chemistry-based coloring method. So bees can create colors on the outside of their sort of, you know, the way we see them, blues and greens and yellows. Those are all structural colors. We can learn from that and try and create colors without using chemistry, for instance. Possibly window coatings, right, that avoid light coming into the buildings. We see that on campus with the retrofit of the UC library, right? They have some mechanisms for shielding light at certain times of day. So there is examples already on campus that kind of obliquely take inspiration from nature. I'm gonna, in the chats, post some links to some resources where people can look into the sort of myriad of ideas that are already out there and are already available. And I'll post a link to the research that Holly did, which is now being featured on asknature.org, which is a great website for bio-inspired design. That's a website out of the States, and they created a whole separate collection page for the material that Holly produced during this collaboration. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I think the best idea is to send you to some resources, and then you can really focus in on what your interests are in terms of the built environment or in terms of kind of DIY. So I'll try and come up with some things in the next 5 minutes in the chat. All right.
No pressure. Okay, so I wonder, we've got a couple questions here just kind of focusing on both the road to becoming a Bee City campus and then sort of carrying it forward. And so I wonder, maybe just the first one, it sounds to me like a question primarily for Amanda and Mindi, but maybe other folks can weigh in on it as well. Could you talk a bit about some of the biggest challenges that you encountered on the road to becoming a Bee City campus?
Yeah, I can start. Probably the biggest challenge was time. So it takes a lot of, there's a process with review and approval just within our own campus. So Mindi actually brought this to me, I think, early 2019. We had this idea and put together the application working closely with the Department of Biological Sciences, the Student Run Garden Club, and the Office of Sustainability. So each of those groups had to review and ensure that the information pertaining to their part was accurate. And then it always has to move up the chain. Also, with the Bee campus designation, the application asks for the highest, like the president's signature, which is not always easy to obtain. So it took a little while to get approved and get submitted. And I think that was the most challenging part. We were lucky that a lot of things we were already doing in the community garden were contributing to enhancing pollinator habitat and awareness and education. And then with the launch of the digital collection, again, we had that educational piece and that awareness piece. So all we really needed to do was celebrate with a big celebration and then commit to continuing and growing the initiatives that we had started.
Right on. So two questions I'm going to pair together a little bit. One of them just asking a general question about, are there other initiatives that either the Office of Sustainability or other departments or folks on campus are working on that would carry the kind of bee-friendlification of UCalgary forward in the future? Anything happening at other campuses? That's the first half of it. And then we have coming in through the chat, a question from Tim about trying to start a specific initiative to support pollinator health at Spy Hill campus. And Tim has a few more specific questions just around like where would one go to learn more about any regulations or requirements in order to, enact native bee-friendly pollinator promotion at Spy Hill. Who would be the contact person? And then, I've given you about 9 different questions. So I think just any ongoing initiatives that are happening on campus in the future, and how could Spy Hill maybe check in with people who are responsible for making our campus more friendly to bees?
Yeah, I can start with some ongoing initiatives. 2 that come to mind are the our edible gardens initiative. So we have the campus community garden, which is like a fenced in designated garden, but there's also an open garden at Crow's Nest Hall that has edible fruit trees. It is available for anyone, but it's not well known about, and there's no signage. And there are other fruit trees around campus that we want to encourage the community to harvest from and to visit and to learn about. So we are working on an initiative to either implement some signage or just raise awareness about those areas and the importance of some of those trees. And then in terms of implementing a pollinator garden at Spy Hill, I think the first thing that you would need to do is get approval. And I think you would start with submitting a request through just the general facilities email, because I know for us, we needed to get approval from both campus architecture and grounds. And it also needs to be established who will be caring for the gardens. So is grounds going to be responsible for the weeding and watering and maintenance, or is there going to be sort of a team of staff that are passionate that will take care of it and plant there? But once you get approval to plant the garden and you know how it's going to be maintained, then it's just learning about what species to plant and designing the garden and then planting it.
Awesome. I think I've got a question here that seems like it would be in Jana's territory, about the popularity of things like bee bombs or bee and pollinator friendly seed mixes. Ian would like to know, is there a good way to determine what's in those mixes, if any of the seeds would be considered invasive? How do you know when you're deciding what to plant, especially if you're planting from a mix, how that's going to interact with our environment here in Calgary? Do you have any tips about that?
Well, it's hard to answer the question for all situations, but a lot of the mixes, they will list what's included in the seed mix. And so before you plant them, you can sort of look through that list and cross-reference it with some of the planting guides that were in the presentation for Alberta specifically. Some of those seed mixes, they're sort of native to Canada, but they're not native to here. They're native to Ontario is common. So you might want to be somewhat cautious there. If the question I read that question, I was a little worried because it sort of said, can you tell from the seeds? I can't. And it would be only a few probably seed experts that probably could identify a species just from the seeds only. So, I mean, you can sort of grow them up until they've got all their features that you can identify them. It's always sort of a fun activity, but yeah, you might end up discovering that it's something that you don't want. I believe that the planting guides that were mentioned in our link in the presentation, they are specific to here, and there's also a list of where you can get where you can source out the seeds. So I would advise just only buying seeds from places that are sort of reputably saying that these are native to Alberta, and be as specific as possible.
Right. Thank you. I wonder if this is a question that maybe as people who are in one way or another interested in pollinators and sort of fascinated with pollination and everything that is connected with it. We have a question from Ron about addressing people's bee phobias that I thought was quite interesting. Typically, people encounter bees. We either, if it's a cute bumble, we might think that it's adorable or fuzzy. Or sometimes people are afraid of bees and might be concerned about being stung by them. I guess maybe, is there a broader question in there about, how do you present bees to people in a way that helps them connect with pollinators and what it means to support them as species in our communities?
Hi, Ron. This is a great question, and I'm sure that you spent lots of time thinking about this with your own research projects. I really like this question because it's actually going to be the focus of a course that I'm teaching this fall on entomology. And as part of that course, I'm going to ask the students who are enrolled. Part of it is they're going to be out exploring the diversity of insects here in Calgary and recording those to iNaturalist and sharing that information out. But the other piece at the end of the term is I want the students to come up with ideas for how to talk to people about insects, to get them excited about insects as they are maybe about some of the more charismatic birds and, and mammals that we have in our city. So that's actually the kind of the theme and the problem that we're going to explore this fall. So hopefully we'll have lots of new resources and ideas on this up on our website come December that people can use.
Awesome. Anyone else have any tips about building the charisma of honeybees, or well, maybe not honeybees, native bees, pollinators in general?
So I would say that actually you don't need to build the charisma of honeybees at all. The more broader issue is actually getting awareness of native bees. And that's actually one of the points that I think that might be easier to make, is that many of the native bees don't sting, right? This is not something they do. And so you're not only encouraging native pollinators that have evolved to be here, but they're also not going to sting you. And it's hard to combat phobias about, and it's been my experience. So I'm actually a vertebrate zoologist. I teach about animals with backbones. And students who have snake phobias or who have spider phobias or you can't really convince people not to have a phobia. It's not a rational reaction. And most people who have them recognize that. You just need to talk to them carefully about what the good things are about the species that they're afraid of. But it's a physiological reaction that they really can't control. And you also want to be sensitive to people who have actual allergies. My sister has to carry EpiPens and had to at her wedding because the photography was outside and there are bees and she's violently allergic to them. So you do have to be sensitive to that too.
Yes, and thank you for catching me in my slip of the tongue. I think that's a marker of just how easy it is to conflate all bees with honeybees, even, having listened to that presentation, taken it in, and guiding a Q&A, I still made the mistake. So I appreciate that. And I guess that leads us to a quick question that we have from what sounds like potentially a student who has researched ecosystems and novel ecosystems in one of his senior courses, asking about kind of how have honeybees interacted with or integrated into Canadian ecosystems, especially around GMO crops, and just kind of maybe can we talk a little bit further about some of those honeybee native bee interactions at the kind of ecosystem or Canada-wide level.
So this is another great question. I would say it's an area of active research currently in terms of exploring kind of honeybees and their interactions with native bees and the role. Actually, one of the attendees here on Mosca is actually studying just this question, but just in Calgary. So what is the impact of having honeybees in the city and their impact on native pollinators? And so he's currently working on his thesis, and I look forward to kind of seeing his results from his project on that.
Awesome. Certainly do as well. I think I'm going to wrap up maybe with one final question, which I'm filing firmly under the cute side of the bee column. One of our attendees has observed that they have often seen bees drinking out of a bird bath, particularly when it's hot. And it sounds like they're maybe concerned or curious, like, is this an issue? Is this part of ordinary bee behavior? How would you parse that?
Yeah, so bees and all insects need to drink water, just like other animals, so you will see them. And I think thinking about how to provide all of the things that kind of our native bees need out in your backyard is really important. So it's always fun to plant lots of diverse flowers for bees to come to, but it's also good to think about, providing water sources as well as ground areas for them to nest and use as well. So kind of thinking about all three, food, water, and shelter when we're designing our outdoor spaces for bee diversity.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm just noticing that we're pretty much about at time. I'm not sure if anybody has any final questions that they're desperate to ask. Please do add them to the chat in the next 10 seconds or so. But otherwise, I just want to extend a huge thank you both to Amanda for sharing your knowledge through the presentation, and to every one of our panelists who, you just brought such an incredible depth of both knowledge and commitment to pollinator health to this webinar. I feel like I've learned so much and have probably a million questions of my own that I may pester you with after this webinar is concluded. But thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our participants for showing up, for learning and asking such great questions. And I hope we can all stay engaged in keeping UCalgary a Bee City campus as we go forward into the summertime.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And we'll be sending the recorded version out within the next couple of days.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.